Hello, everyone. Waiting for a few more folks to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Lovely to see you all here. Okay, I'll begin now. Good evening. Happy Black History Month. My name is Joel Diaz. I am the Director of Programs at the Clifton House. I am joined here by Zara Gordon, our graduate communications intern, and an MFA student in the Creative Writing and Publishing Arts program at the University of Baltimore. Zara is supporting me in all the behind the scenes work to make this event happen and helping me steward the tech for tonight's program. So give her a round of applause. It feels important that before tonight's conversation, I offer you a bit of context to the Clifton House in my own poetic way. The Clifton House at once was and at present is the home of Lucille and Fred Clifton and their six children. In 1980, the home was lost to foreclosure, and so began the wind, spanning its 40 years, lifting and carrying the dandelion seeds of their heart until the wind settled, and all along its path it left a garden, each one leading back to this home. In 2019, Sydney Clifton, with her eye heart and horizon of a vision, reacquired the home, and like the dandelion seed, she is a parachute holding the air for safe landing. And in this way, too, she is a lung, extending the breath of our becoming. And so the Clifton House is a sanctuary to nurture the artist and activist in all of us. During our time together this evening, our panelists will discuss Molly's book, Scrap Theory, Reproductive Injustice in the Black Feminist Imagination, in which she considers the histories of state-sanctioned maternal dispossession and accents the importance of the creative and documentary work by contemporary visual and literary artists as an essential tool to shift our understanding of fragmentation and caregiving. Molly and Nadejda will explore how art making provides a counterpoint to the historically ephemeral and violent acts of the redactive archive toward a history that celebrates the timelessness of Black women's memory work. I'll share more about the panelists here. Dr. Molly D. Collins, is a creative writer and doula living in Baltimore, Maryland. Her poetry and creative essays have been featured in Salt, Contemporary Art and Feminism, The Haunt Journal of Art, A Gathering Together, and in edited anthologies from Demeter Press and University of Mississippi Press. She recently finished her tenure as a poet in residence with Yellow Arrow Publishing, where she developed further her chapbook on the themes of kinship and separation. Since 2021, she has been an assistant professor of African and African diaspora studies at American University in Washington, D.C., where she teaches courses on politics of Black motherhood and contemporary Black feminist literature and art. Dr. Nadejda Webb is an assistant research professor at the Center for the Digital Humanities at Johns Hopkins University and the assistant director of Life Code Digital Humanities Against Enclosure. In 2023, she founded the We Live Language Lab within Black Beyond Data, a computational humanities and social science ecosystem. WLL is centered on the writings and spoken word of Afro-diasporic poets, authors, and philosophers, exploring the intricate relationship between language and power. Before we begin, I'd like to let you all know that you can still purchase copies of Molly's book from Greedy Reads. We'll be posting the link in the chat. These will be signed because we have to pivot the event. These will be signed. So if you purchase a copy, she will personalize it for you. So please be sure to do so. And when you check out from the Greedy Reads website, make sure you click on the Remington location. That is essential to get your book signed. During the conversation, we also encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A chat box. That way we can make sure your questions are asked during the conversation. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Nadejda Webb. Enjoy the conversation, everyone.
Thank you, Joelle. Hi, everyone. I want to first thank the Clifton House for organizing and curating this event, and Dr. Miley Collins for her compelling and dynamic text. I also want to welcome our audience members this evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that I find you grounded in the spirit, capacity, and vivaciousness of your ancestors, especially in this time marked by enclosure. Um, I also want to mention that today is Trayvon Martin's 31st birthday, and I would like to wish him a happy heavenly birthday. Um, and recall the fullness of his life. Um, I will dive right in with our first question. So, Dr. Collins, thank you so much again for your work for this book. I will say a part of me wants to first ask about what you were experiencing when you wrote this book, because as I complete each chapter, I find that I'm like simultaneously inspired by what each artist accomplished, what each writer did, but also feeling the weight of what was taken from them. So even in Margaret Walker's chapter, Reckoning, right, with that fight against Roots, the impact of that lawsuit. Um, I just as I just wonder what you experienced when you were crafting it, and where were you, your affective reality? Like what was happening, right? As you were both exploring, doing like the archival research for each chapter, but also like crafting a narrative, because that's the other aspect of this. Each chapter, like it doesn't, I know it's research. I can spot the research, but it's a story and I'm compelled and I want to read and I'm drawn into the story and I'm drawn into the emotional landscapes that each of these people are inhabiting and the things that they're experiencing as they're doing the work that we also read about that we're able to then understand as research. Can you tell us a bit about that before we even dive into what scrap theory is?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for that wonderful welcome. Thank you to the Clifton House. Thank you to everyone who's supporting the event and everyone that's here. I also just wanted to take a moment also to thank all of the multiple people in my home right now taking care of my children so that I can be here. And also the people supporting you, Nadejda, with your childcare so that you could be here. Um, what's interesting about your question is, we had obviously spoken before this. When I saw this as a potential question that you were going to ask, I read it as, who were you when you were writing
I
this?
think that's actually what I put. Yes, yes.
Yeah, but that's like a much more difficult question for me, I think, to answer. But I, I mean, nevertheless, I begin the book with I began writing the book
Mhm.
while I was in labor with my first child. And I was reckoning with the reality and just kind of like the pain thinking about Tamir Rice and the idea of me giving birth to a Black son. Um, Reckoning with the idea that, how long would he be with me?
Mhm.
Once he's outside of me. How is his age numbered? How are our days together numbered?
Mhm.
When I felt such a fear bringing him in this outside world, I could no longer protect him inside of me. But I think also what supported me and continues to support me, right, is this through line of this long genealogy of women, of mothers, of parents that I also belong to, that we are always reckoning with these questions about the longevity, the tenure of our children's lives, our impact on them, and also that which we cannot protect them from. I I really appreciate you noting that there are these through lines, and maybe we can talk about this more too. But also the narrative through line is not just these atrocities that I was traumatized. We're all traumatized by, right, of these killings of Black boys and men in recent years, but also, visual art and how I turned toward to visual art and literature to really make sense of what I couldn't name as, this affective reality of what I just felt like was just foreclosure or just a sense of constant death or yeah, just a state, almost like a death state, right? Um, and so when writing the book, I'm not just having one child, I'm having two children. And then when I'm proofing it, I'm having a third child. And I think actually you can trace to the end of the book, to the epilogue, through the conclusion to the epilogue, not necessarily thinking of ending on this note of hope or, okay, now we're putting a bow on it and I feel much better, but rather have the more Black children I produce and the more children I spend time with and I'm fortunate enough to raise in community, my fear actually grows and the questions that I have about our life purpose grows as well.
Thank you so much for that answer. I have several thoughts. One being that I remember when I was almost about to give birth. So I have a Black daughter, and I was almost about to give birth. And I remember saying to a close friend of mine that we were discussing daycare and we were discussing the expectation of when the child should enter daycare and this expectation that as a working parent, a working mother, that would be like a quick process, right? Like you have 6 weeks or you have X amount of time and that's what you do. And I was trying to explain to her that, right? The fear that is about institutionalized precarity, institutionalized violence, but also we've been in intimate relation for I've known her if the 9 months of her being in wherever she is, I have known her, and then she should be somewhere else, and we should somehow transition to this state somehow seamlessly, and it should be without it shouldn't feel like a rupture. Somehow it should just be a thing that we're able to do. Um, and um, when I hear you talk about the tenure of our children's lives, I'm also brought to the point that you have the longest memory of your child, and that like how do you articulate that intimacy and um, the weight of that knowledge, the weight of that awareness, the fullness of that awareness. Um, Especially in light of all of, like that the precarity in light of the state sanctioned violence, right? um I think there's so much to say, so much more to say there. um Unpacking that effective, like those feelings and what it means to bear those feelings and what it means, like I call my kid my uterus friend, but what it means to like work through that she is a being in the world and I'm also a being in the world, and sometimes like we risk something in being in the world. um Yes, I don't think that's an answer. I think that's just my visceral response to some of to your answer. Um Indeed, so you say yes, turning to visual art to make sense of this, make sense of what it means to hold those feelings and what it means to kind of live within that tension because we're functioning within that tension. My child or my multiple children, they're beings in the world, and I'm risking something and having them here, even as I tether them with my love, or even as I tether them however I can, right? And provide the safety, whatever safety is within my capacity to provide. Um, I I think this is a great moment to like unpack scrap theory and what scrap theory is and what the visual art, the production of literature, in this case, Jubilee, These Bones Are My Child, are not my child, pardon me, what these offer us as we think about scrap theory.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, everything you said made sense to me. I think also, when I'm thinking about, before I kind of get to teasing out scrap theory, I also wanted to mention that in another timeline, in another universe, that this book iterates as a book about Elizabeth Catlett's sculpture specifically, right? And I think a lot about while I was writing it, I was thinking she has a mother-child series, right? A series of sculptures that she started in 1939, and you know, the last one that she sculpted was probably around like 2003, 2005. Okay. So, like, you mean potentially hundreds of different versions of what she forms of like these mother figurines with children attached to them, right? And she had a 7-year stint where she did not practice any type of artwork at all, right? Decorated artist. She moved to Mexico, had 3 sons. After her last child was born, she found that it was untenable to continue her creative practice while she was raising these children. And she took a 7-year gap. And when she returned after 7 years, right, she decided to hone her practice away from carving these mother and child figures out of one piece of obsidian or onyx. And
Mm,
after the 7 years, she decided that there would always be separate figurines,
interesting.
right? That they would no longer be formed together. And you can actually see this, like if you've seen some of her exhibits, the materials that she uses and how she separates them.
Mm,
And that's because she had her own type of reckoning with, her children leaving her.
yeah.
And she has this like really beautiful quote about how children must learn to leave their mothers and mothers must learn to let them go. And that is really the task, right? Our maternal task the second that they are born. And so it's stories like those that really make up the breadth of what scrap theory is, right? It's this radical approach to what is useless and what is precious,
Mm,
right? What is invaluable and what is priceless and what is important to one person to another. I think a lot of the interesting thing about the book, right, like I said, is that there's just so much. Thank you, Joelle. There's just so many things, right, like on the cutting floor, but I'm also scaling these registers of anti-Black violence to talk about what else is left behind, right? So when
mm,
I'm talking about scraps, I'm not just simply talking about the idea that like so much of Southern cuisine is made up of food scraps or scraps of actual animals, right, that we were allowed to eat. I'm also talking about Tori Kambambara's practice of writing novels on paper plates that
mm,
have chicken grease on them, right? Because her daughter loved chicken when she was writing those novels. I'm also talking about the idea that Black people's body parts were trafficked and sold, as in memoriam of lynching, like the spectacle of lynchings, right? So I think that there's many ways that Black folks historically have been materially fragmented.
mm,
But then I'm also talking, in a very material sense, but I'm also just thinking generally about just documentation practices. So if we have been archived and documented under these certain material practices of kind of like what is left or what is refused, well, how have we also embraced that which is marginalia, is
mm,
on the outside, right? How much of, that 7 year stint, like that I just said, that Elizabeth Catlett did not produce artwork, right? But she raised three Black boys nearly into adulthood during that time, which is just as much a creative practice.
yeah.
And I think that's really what scrap theory attends to is it's a certain type of Black feminist methodology. It's an approach to understanding not just that, say, care work is work, but also the idea of memory keeping, of community building is very much something that hinges on that which is not legible to other people. And that does not make it any less important. In fact, it actually makes it more potent and more precious for us as a people.
Mm. And okay. Um, thank you for that response. Um, I the so I really want you to say more about how attending to the quotidian allows us to account for invisibilized archival labor. But I'm also really drawn to your comment about scale because I think like absolutely yes. Also so much more there as well. Um, because so I'm gonna put scale down, but I'm gonna go back to the quotidian. And as you mentioned Toni Cade Bambara's plate, I also remember in the text, in the book, in that chapter, where you talk about what's in the box, like the crumbs and the bits and the pieces that are just in the box, and the what that also allows us to witness. Um, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you ever have the opportunity, I highly suggest going to Spelman Archives to not just investigate what's going on in Toni Gibbon-Barr's boxes, but also Audre Lorde's boxes are there. And there's like a very interesting conversation that's going on that I'll talk about in a second.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, so Those Bones Are Not My Child was Toni Gibbon-Barr's only posthumously published work, right? Published in 99, 2000. She passed away in 94, 95. And it was really like her opus about the Atlanta child murders. But what I think is really interesting about this novel that she created out of it is that it was solely based on her experience as a community organizer, right? Not necessarily like an Atlanta resident who was just experiencing what was on the news, but actually working with families, trying to find their children, taking care of the other children in the home, cooking for people, um, and then taking her daughter to all of these meetings, right? And so she showed up very much in during that crisis, not as a journalist or as an author, but also as just a fellow parent and a community member. And so when you go to her archives of all of the, I mean, it took her so long to write this, and actually Toni Morrison ended up finishing it and editing it for her. I mean, it's clearly was something that haunted her. Okay, so it's like gum wrappers with storylines. As you said in the book, I discussed the paper plate, um, in which she's actually mapping out, the gestational period of like all of when her characters' children would have been inside of their mother, which is fascinating. Um, she also has, like I said, there's chicken grease on these paper plates. There's a type of urgency to the story that she was writing, right? That could not wait until after dinner. There are pieces of her hair, right, that she let in Audre Lorde's boxes as well, right? Lexis Pauline Gooms writes about this, but there are like her scrunchies with hair still wrapped around them. There's pieces of things that belong to her daughter, right? Karma at the time. And so I think it's very interesting that someone who's going through the archives and I'm sifting through all of these things well, what is the story that these objects are telling along with that which I'm researching, right? And so what I found in all of these, what I would usually describe as like refused objects, were actually like some of the most intensely written novelist notes, right? She has like a home shopping network catalog, in which she was circling every single thing that she thought certain characters would wear, right? And I think it just speaks to how much it just occupied her life, right? It was like it there's a specific article that's published in the Atlanta Constitution, which she looks extremely weary, right? In this image. And she says in the article, and she's interviewed, that she looks like that because the story is haunting her. And so when we think about characters or stories or atrocities that follow authors or creatives around, we also have to think about what they were doing when they were haunted by these things. And she was raising a child, right? And I think in any, this is to shout out Holly Smith and then also the other archivists at Spelman. This is to their credit, right, for processing these items as archival documentation and not necessarily gifting them back or throwing them out, but rather, again, processing them, which is, there's a whole politics behind the institutional legibility of that. But actually putting a paper plate, a scrunchie in a finding aid, I think is very revolutionary.
Absolutely. So I'm now thinking about to the question of scale and how scale is operating within the text, the scale of the paper plate, to then also thinking about in the same chapter, you say, rather than an event, the set of relations that produce Black disappearance is an ongoing project with spatial and spiritual implications. So also thinking, and this reminds me of Laura Harjo, like the scale of world making, if we think about like the spiritual, but also like the scale of a set of relations and what it actually takes to institute a set of relations that allows, permits in various forms disappearance. Do you want to say a bit more about that, about scale?
Yeah, and I think I can do that by way of thinking about the function of light, right? I write about this in the book too, which is that some I think one of the most innovative forms of Toni Cade Barr's writing is that she has this amazing like kaleidoscopic um, purview to highlight these aspects of the Atlanta child murders that no one else was talking about, right? And so while we were talking perhaps like in the media or James Baldwin's Evidence of Things Not Seen, right, which he writes about the Atlanta child murders, is very much focused on, rightfully the loss of these children, what happened to these children and the killers. Tony Kimambar is talking about a different thing, which is why are we tearing down Southeast Atlanta so that we can build an airport while all of this is happening, right? Why are we not attending to the joblessness of the Black veterans returning back from the Vietnam War? That's what she's writing about and talking about those elements of disappearance, right? Black people being taken or removed or dispossessed and then returning to something that they don't remember or they don't recognize anymore. Why aren't those things in conversation with the fact that now these Black children are being disappeared, right? And so I think her Black feminist approach helps us again scale all the way back, right, to colonization, to enslavement. Okay. We think about the idea of disappearance or reappearing, right? One, us being able to visually see something and then them not occupying that space anymore, like a darkness, right? We also have to think about the fact that the majority of people who were kidnapped from West Africa were done so during the nighttime, right? And so that gives us like a whole other approach to thinking about scale in terms of, when Black people are disappeared, what stories we're actually focusing on, right? But I think throughout the book, right, and then in the title, I use this phrase reproductive injustice because ultimately when I'm talking about scale, I'm talking all of these as
Yeah.
reproductive injustices.
Right.
It's not just Black children being disappeared from places,
Mhm.
but when we're talking about a reproductive injustice, we're talking about a disappearance from homeland, from motherland. We're talking about a disappearance or the denial of one learning their own mother tongue, right? And that's far and beyond these conversations that we have about reproductive injustice now, which is almost completely whitewashed into this idea of one's right to not have children, but rather we should consider consistently
Mm.
colonization, white supremacy, anti-Black violence in all of its forms as a reproductive injustice. And Black feminists and Black women writers and artists, I think in particular, are helping us animate the other dimensions of reproductive injustice and kind of helping us scale up these registers of violence so that we can really see how embedded reproductive injustice is in our daily lives, but also in the worlds that we are now making on a quotidian and a large scale.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I will say, I, as I was reading, and that chapter, that is the first chapter, where you give like a really just thorough dissection, because it's not just a discussion, it's a dissection of disappearance. Um, I couldn't I couldn't help but think about like the disappearances that we're witnessing now, right? Like these state enforced, like this um very much this moment that we're in. And that's one of the reasons I was like, well, effectively, where was she? What was she thinking about? Because it's such a fitting what you discuss here is such a fitting, it's so useful to also framing this moment, to thinking deeper about this moment. And otherwise, you do say in another article, the Black Agenda Report Book Forum, you talk about relocating Black mothers and their children as the bellwethers in our ongoing reproductive battles for the right to raise children into adulthood. And indeed, right, as you just explained, you expand our conception of this to include mother tongue and motherland. Um, as you were as you were writing, so the mother, that's the third chapter, and you deal with the Edwidge Danticat there. Um, disappearance really emerges in the first chapter, where you're addressing the Atlanta child murders and Toady Kane Bambara. Were those were written at different times? Can you talk about, right, like thinking about those, so obviously they're touching each other, they're intersecting, they're deeply connected. But can you walk us through, as you were thinking about this and digesting what feels distinct but is deeply intertwined? What was that experience? Was there a moment where you're like, actually, this is a thing that leads me right here? I mean, you give an accounting of this in the text, obviously, but I'm wondering too, what else was there as you were thinking through this?
I'm like, do I? I don't remember that part. No, I'm just, you're such a close reader. No, I mean, I think, well, one, I mean, it's important to understand that, when we're thinking about like this big C, I talk about this with my students, we think about this big C colonization as something like that's this right here thing that then we're enacting out there when really it's happening right, right here in front of our faces, right? So it's like very much I wanted to think about Atlanta also as this very colonized space, like this farm Atlanta was once farmland, right? With like these winding streets and these winding roads.
Mm,
And then, basically got paved over. So that mainly during the late 70s and 80s to make way for the for what was an Olympic bid, a Summer Olympics bid at the time. But what's interesting about your question about the conversations that are going on, I want to take this question a different place, which is that, Nadejda, these were two chapters that multiple reviewers and editors were like, we hate these chapters.
interesting.
Yes, and in fact, they do not talk to each other.
Mm,
Yeah.
interesting.
It is interesting, but I think that I'm like, well, I think what's most interesting about it though is that those are two chapters that I think are closest read on fiction
Mm, okay.
and use fiction as the document, right? For instance, in the third chapter, right, when I'm talking about Dante Cott and her use of In Breath Eyes Memory,
Mm,
where she's fictionalizing her own experience being sexually violated by her own mother, right? That's really the chapter where I take this turn where it's no longer thinking about, again, this external white supremacy boogeyman that's enacting all of these violences onto African diasporic people, to me really thinking about the ways that white supremacy functions intramurally as intramural anti-Blackness, right?
mm,
And then if you want to get even deeper into it, right, it's not so much when we think about sexual or reproductive violence, right? These are not necessarily things that are, Black male perpetrators onto Black girls, right? This is also a dynamic between it's the mother-child dyad, it's the mother-daughter dyad,
yeah,
right? The policing of sexual behavior, the policing of purity,
yeah.
the physical abuse, the physical
Mm,
sexual abuse in that book it's enacted by her mother, right? It's
yeah.
her real account. Um, and then just, thinking about Haiti as this lost motherland for Dante Cotte herself, right? As she's writing this book as an 18-year-old, she's recounting these things. And also, as she has said in interviews, thinking about how her mother could possibly receive this book. But
Mm,
I don't think she's just talking about her mother. I think she's also talking about Haiti,
yeah.
right? Who am I, this young Haitian woman, Haitian American woman, to be writing about my homeland, right, in a type of way where it seems unsafe, right? In a country, in a metropole that is, basically evacuating all of its resources, right, as we speak. But using Toni Cade Bambara and Dante Cot, I think, creates an interesting tension, right? And tension is ultimately just an energy, right? That's very generative for us to think more about predominantly Black spaces, predominantly Black cities, and how anti-Blackness is functioning intramurally, right?
Mm,
Among while we're experiencing all of this white supremacist violence as well.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Okay. I am gonna do um a time check-in with Joel. Joel, I don't know if you want to slip it in the chat, how much more time we have. Um, I, you've given, I think, us so much to think about, especially in terms of accounting for intramural violence. 8 more minutes, especially in thinking about intramural violence. Um, hmm, when you were thinking about scale, was that a conscious? Because even it's curious, right? You're able to we have the scale from mother to child, we have ancestor, we have descendants. We have multiple iterations of world building, what it takes to the different like multiple sets of relations that it takes to constitute a world or to decimate a world. Um, we have now the scale of the not just a community that is cohesive, right? But the complexity of community that is also um what does it mean, or what happens when communities are they're not cohesive? Intramural violence. What does it mean to account for violence that is between a mother and a child? Um, Even if that comes out of a space of desiring protection, because in that her mother does want to protect her, and her mother is seriously like her mother's suffering in multiple ways, right? But this also becomes an outlet for that suffering. Um, I just I love the way you treat scale here.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you. I mean, I think I think that we could, it's also really important to know, right? Like in that chapter, I'm talking about this sculpture, maybe Joelle, you can put it in the chat, by Levon Bell,
mm,
and where she's taking the rocks from St. Croix, right? And these rocks that are mainly like sea urchin, other like sea life, right? That it's then like was used by enslaved people. Enslaved people were forced to labor to compact like the sea, basically like the sea material, harden it, and use it as the foundations for their institutions, like their banks, their libraries, and very much like made up literally the structure of the island. And so when people are forced to do these to perform this labor, the spikes from the sea urchin are getting in their skin,
mm,
right? And it's creating this I mean, we could also think about Christina Sharp's like staying power about blood, staying in the ocean and things like that. But it's also this like non-consensual biological relationship then that enslaved Africans and the sea life are forced into,
mm,
right? Where they must work together to create then like the institutions for these white supremacist institutions.
mm,
Um, and so I think the Caribbean in general, but also Down to Cut's work helps us think of against scale, what reproductive in violation is, right? Because in so far as maybe one is brought to St. Croix non-consensually, right? But that is your home now, right? And you have your own culture. Um, and it's like I'm kind of all over the place here, but it's also thinking about, like James Baldwin's unwieldy patriotism, right? Like any chance he could get, he was always like, I love America, I want it to get better. But it's like, what does that mean for the colonized subject, and how much does that actually impede or inform what we think about reproducing ourselves in like this new space that we were brought in non-consensually to?
mm,
Um, I think Dantica plays with that a lot, right? What am I doing here? I didn't
mm.
choose to be here. But what does it mean to like love my mother anyway?
Yeah,
Want to make it better and want to
yeah.
the best I can reset this set of relations that
Mm,
almost requires my own subjugation.
mm, yes. And that I'm verifying, that actually makes me think about one of her, another text, um, Clear of the Sea Light, and actually the relationship that we see uh, between father and daughter, but also the relationship between father, daughter, and the sea.
Mhm.
And that, like, thinking about, um, yet, like, this, how one mirrors the other, there's a lot there in terms of what Danticat does with nature. And I certainly agree about her, because even in that book, the mother dies, and the father's trying to figure out what to do with the daughter. And the daughter is like, well, indeed, I am here. And the father is also like, indeed, I am here. But, and yet, what do we do? We're bound. And it's interesting, right? Because even there, he's not like he deeply loves his child, but he's grappling with, well, what do I do in the absence of your mother? How do I stand by you? How do I hold you dearly? How do I support you if I don't have enough money? Because something is in fact happening to the sea. All of the fish are gone. Um, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, um, would it be okay if I just read a small portion of that chapter?
Yeah.
Do we have time? Because I think that yeah, I talk about methodology and I think about the water as methodology in
Yes,
this
yeah, you do.
chapter, right? So Okay. So, Mami Wata is the fluid unfooting of the intimacies situated in this chapter, where the goal of analysis is connecting the body, land, and origin. Yamaya, the water that rises and falls on a whim, whose temper is slow to erupt, whose borders invade shores without permission and create metaphor for the unpredictability of the relationality in the diaspora, is the method. Motherlands do not become less unpredictable under militarized governments and fascist politics. They become increasingly enraged by them.
Mm.
In such systems of upheaval, the land becomes water and water becomes land, blending into the instability of known space and time. As one Haitian said after the devastating 2008 earthquake, it's like the earth itself has become liquid, like the ocean. My method wrestles with how land and water are as fused as those who claim them as mothers, painting an omnipresent question of origin and bodies in the diaspora. Bodies expand like the water, quake like the earth, and threaten our allegiance to what we know to be true and what we cannot comprehend. We might ask ourselves what it means to purely, quote, be like water. Water, destructive and rejuvenative, is more weighty and destructive when it becomes the sum of its parts. And as one of my genius students, Isaiah Washington, writes, the water is both life and the water is death. I believe, no, I believe that it's not just the motherland, but it's also the water, right, that creates these islands, that creates these archipelagos, that creates these things that we call countries and continents that also help shape, right, with help shape obviously not just the trafficking and it was the portal through which we traveled through these places, but it also, I think, creates a lot of questions, right? It's like very much the abyss. It's the middle passage that very much I think kind of is the metaphor for how we're thinking about memory and how I think about documentation and archival possibility too in the book.
Thank you. I also, well, particularly in Clear of the Sea Light, it also registers, right, like the environmental degradation, but also environmental decline that is, it's not directly produced by the inhabitants, right, of Haiti. In this case, right, it's the product of the global north. Um, and their kind of like the destructive nature of all of these processes or the byproduct, right? Indirect and direct, um, that then the folks on the ground are facing. So certainly, I think, thank you for that. It certainly registers a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think also like, Black folks, but in particular also, Black children are often always seen as menaces to space
Mm,
and menaces to land and inherently, environment degrading the environment, right? And I think about this also what I talk about in the book of, the murder of Tamir Rice
mm,
and not just, all of these terrible things about whether or not he should be playing with a toy gun and things like that. But it was just very much should he have been in the park in the middle of the day? Right. That was very much something that came up, right? It was just like, well, it was a really cold day. What
mm,
type of mother would let their child out in the middle of a cold day? Right? This like ridiculous question, but it's because he was occupying space. He was just existing while Black, right? And then, again, in the chapter, I'm talking about his mother, Samaria Rice,
mm,
who is fighting to keep the gazebo, and they don't want the remnants.
yeah,
They don't want his remnants. They don't want his memories in this, what is supposed to be a play space, because they think it's just too depressing. So she takes the materials, which she had to fight to have, and she tries to erect them, put them in the Cleveland Museum of Art, but they don't want it. Tries to take it to Chicago. They don't want it. I think it's so interesting, right? Just thinking about this murder of this young child,
mm,
then it turns out to be his fault, and he's the menace, right, in this space, or he's this thing that is creating a stain on a place of play.
mm,
But that's really the memory, I think, of colonization, is the memory of white supremacy, right?
mm,
That's enacting the violence.
mm. Um, Folks, we're gonna open up the chat for questions now. So we are transitioning to Q&A. Molly, thank you so much for your comments, for having this discussion with me. I'm so excited to have a second read.
Hey, me too, sister.
So
Been a while.
I really, I'm so energized, and I'm so energized by the writing. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you so much.
Folks, we are now opening up the conversation to you. So please, if you have a question about something that we discussed or did not discuss, let us know. Okay, well, I have a question about form because you have
I think we
these.
have a question
Oh,
from an audience member.
awesome.
And so I'm
Gotcha.
gonna sort of unmute their mic to see if they can ask, but it's from Yewande. So take it if you can, Yewande.
Yeah, I see it in the chat. Yolanda is asking about how community plays a role, particularly in artistic community in shaping motherhood and art. Yeah, there's a couple ways I could answer this. I think that community is absolutely integral. I'll start where I ended, right? Thinking about the movement of the Tamir Rice gazebo to the Stony Island Arts Bank. Um,
Mm,
you know, um, so it was actually the community, right? It wasn't just like this city that murdered Tamari Rice's son that didn't want this gazebo. It was actually her neighbors that didn't want the gazebo, and that's a majority Black neighborhood that didn't want this gazebo, right? And so actually, it's because of their dissent that she decided to create an artistic practice, right? She also did other installations with his toys. She was also documenting and saving things like his old baby blankets that then she's making sure like a community that's welcoming of those items, it's available to them. But I also think that if you have an opportunity to ever read Margaret Walker's journals or like go down like a very nerdy wormhole as I did, um, it's Elizabeth Catlett who Margaret Walker moves into when she finds her home when she finds out she's pregnant. When she can't tell her parents that she's pregnant in 1938, she goes to stay with Elizabeth Catlett and she helps her hide her pregnancy. It's Elizabeth Catlett who says you can come down to Mexico and we will co-raise your child together, for 2 years while you finish Jubilee. And I can also speak, and maybe you can also maybe you'll agree with this, Nadejda, that again, I mean, the reason I'm speaking is because my community is watching my children. The reason that I get any type of creative writing done is because most of my community is here listening right now. Um, I think that motherhood and parenthood in general demands
mm,
community engagement. I
mm.
think that if you don't have any type of community engagement, that's not a type of parenting that I don't think would ever, I don't think that it would produce good citizens, to be honest. Um, but the artistic practice that is able to just occur or be completed from having community engagement, I think is everywhere all over the book. As I said, Toni K. Bambara was a community member first. I'm very good friends with her granddaughter, Zoe Bambara, and something that Zoe says that's passed down in her family is that they are not raising children. The Bambaras are not raising children. The Bambaras are raising community members and good community members. And I think when you have that at the fore of parenting or at the fore of your creative practice, then you produce something that is really an object of liberation for people.
Yeah. As I was reading the text, I really like the connection with the quotidian and with community and with these refused objects. Um, Something that I've been parsing through as I'm a transplant to Baltimore. I have a project that is emergent with a Black woman cultural worker here, Miss Sharina Christmas, who's been in the community for 20 years. And one of the discussions that we've return to, right, is how to account for the labor of Black women cultural workers, because often it goes under the banner of care work. But it's really easy, right, to throw away care work. And so something is, so for me, I think like if we're thinking about like artistic community, if we're thinking about motherhood, if we're thinking about art, oftentimes there is a accounting for the labor that allows for motherhood is also really important. And it's like you need, I think scrap theory is really dynamic in that it allows for you to look at actually like the very quotidian day-to-day, right, work that allows all of these things to happen. Indeed, if you are, and I think like Black women writers have been discussing this, right? Like the things that happen at the kitchen table. How do I, Toni Morrison, how did I, like, you have a footnote in there where she talks about actually, I couldn't tell my daughter that, or couldn't tell my children that I'm writing now. So I stole the time to write. Um, so I think I say this to say, um, indeed, they are constitutive. And if you're an artist and you have a child, you often are relying on someone else's labor to help you to do what you desire to do and to produce what you desire to do in the world, to mother something else that is not a child. But even as a part of that question, I also hear like, well, how do we account for that labor? How do we reflect the value of that labor and the impact of that labor? And sometimes, like in the archive, you also need that because archives do so much to instantiate value and to tell us what is valuable, what we will continue to hold pardon me, what we will continue to hold as valuable as someone after someone transitions. Um, I think there's so much in this text that answers this question. Yeah. Thank you so much for your question.
Yeah, thank you for the great question.
Yeah. Are there All right, so I'm not sure if I'm missing another question in the chat, but while we wait, I want to ask you about form. And you have these short, each chapter is constituted by these short parts. And I was wondering, as you were planning the text, as you were writing, was that like what sort of conscious decisions were you making around form? And did this shift depending, right, on the labor of motherhood, or depend like what was this process as you were piecing the thing together? Or is that just the way you write?
Um, okay, so like I can answer this in a very like non-sexy way, which is that I'm actually a very long-winded writer.
Okay.
This was the this was the mandate of the editor, which was like these things need to be shorter, right? These things need to be more like chewable, more palatable for
Mhm.
people. And so, I've never written a prologue or an epilogue in my life, right? But the prologue was a first chapter. The introduction was another chapter. My conclusion was another chapter, and my epilogue was a chapter. Um, and yeah, I think it was very much like an editorial battle that I lost.
Okay.
Very much that I lost. I would like to also announce another editorial battle that I lost that is just the title of the book, right? And I don't think that it would be, I love my publisher, I love my editors so much. I also think that, I don't think that a book on theory is the most approachable,
Mm.
especially for the audience that I'm interested in. The audience that I'm interested in are just any people, Black women creatives, parents are not, and they're allies, right? And I think, yeah, I think that my answer falls more under like these pernicious strictures of things like academic legibility and
Okay.
tenure
Okay.
legibility. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for answering.
Yeah, of course.
Um, Folks, I will also say that if you just want to jump, like unmute yourself, I don't, is that possible, Joel? If you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question that way, because I think I may miss something in the chat and I would like to hear your question. So please, we would like to hear your question. So absolutely, please just jump in. I will say that I didn't I it still feels so approachable, even though it uses the term theory. I even thought like prefacing the text with that narrative around Ida also was such a visceral, clear um entry point and such an important entry point, but also like I think the effective does so much work here and such an important effective entry point. Truly thinking about like actually, even as we're thinking about theory, we're also thinking about the embodied, right? What's embodied. And a part of that are the feelings.
Yeah, they are the feelings, and that's also a tension that I wrestle with is like that which can't be documented on an institution level, but also is in our bodies, right? Like thinking about things like PTSD as a reproductive injustice, of our children being taken away from us. We're thinking about the prevalence of fibroids in many Black women, and thinking about that as like a what happens over decades and centuries of us not getting enough vitamin D, right? Not living on a continent anymore where we're getting the sun and we're not getting vitamin D, and what that does to our reproductive justice systems as well. Um,
We do have one a question that just came up from Omavi. If I'm mispronouncing your name, tell me, jump in, come unmute. You ask, may you tell us about what you're working on now and how it builds on or relates to scrap theory?
oh, thank you, Omavi. That's a great question. Um, so while I was writing the book, and I was writing this chapter on Margaret Walker's her court case against Alex Haley. I also at the same time was for my own sanity. I was writing a fictional a chapter, my first chapter of fiction, on Margaret Walker's first encounters with astrology and how she became an
Oh, yeah.
astrologist.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So Omavi, I think to answer your question, right now I'm writing a lot of poetry that attends to some of the themes in the book around, as Joelle said, around like kinship and separation, things that I think could be narrativized differently in the poetic form. Um, and also I'm writing an essay on love right now. And I think that after writing so many texts on Black non-age death, it's an interesting turn, not just like in terms of like thematically, but also I think it's interesting for me to wrestle with as a creative about what how writing and researching death so much has expanded my definition and my own capacity for empathy and love.
Hmm. Hmm. Do you want to tell us more about Margaret, about her? I'm really curious. How did she learn? And also, this was a part of her research practice, as you know in the book. But how did she learn? How did she get into astrology?
Okay, so Margaret Walker, almost all of Jubilee, right, the huge novel that's her family's history, is a recantation from her grandmother. Okay.
Yes, yes.
Her grandmother, eventually her dad had her grandmother move out of the house because he was like, you're distracting Margaret from her work. She's my prodigy, stop distracting her. But she doesn't really say it outright, but basically in her journal, she intimates that her grandmother was also teaching her astrology. And her father was a pastor, and so he was like, no, this is like voodoo.
Ah, family beef.
Yes, family beef, spiritual beef, right? And no, but if you open up her journal, she draws like the charts of all of like Arna Bontemps of Gwendolyn Brooks for her for like she was doing her French charts. She made money while she was a Richard Wright's graduate assistant by doing natal charts, doing forecasts for people's Saturn returns for her professors at Northwestern. That's how she made money, but it's also how she timed publication dates. So she would wait to publish things after certain transits. She actually turned down an engagement with a lovely suitor because she wanted to go through her Saturn return before she got married. So it very much governed the way that she published, the way she
Yeah.
lived. She predicted her husband's death in the early 90s based on like a Neptune transit he was going through. No, but I mean, it was a huge part of her life, which is,
Wow.
she's seen as very conservative.
And
Um,
that is not good. Okay, yes, okay.
oh, yeah.
Wow. So, but now I want to know how did you said her grandmother or her great grandmother, is there any accounting for that? How did they come into this knowledge? How did they come into this practice?
There's no accounting, and that's what I explore in the
Mm.
fictionalized essay, which is in the Black Fire This Time, Volume 2, which was published by the which is published by University of Mississippi Press. But no, I'm just critically fabulating. I just think it's an ancestral practice that was passed down through the Black woman in her family.
That is fantastic. Like that
Yeah,
is such a fantastical
I
and
know.
like amazing connection to like land and the sky, right? Oh, we do have another question. Can you talk about your experience as a doula and how this practice resists reproductive injustices?
Sure. So, I've been a postpartum and abortion doula for going on almost 8 years. Just as the beginning of the book was a response to this wrestling with this like postpartum anxiety, and postpartum OCD that I had around my son's safety. I think like within 2 months of him being born, I was like, I have to be a doula too, right? And I became a childbirth educator. I did that for a while. Um, and I also led a lot of groups for Black mothers at Black maternal or Black infant health in Los Angeles County. And eventually I started working with teens, because my friends were high school and middle school teachers and they had so many students that were pregnant, right? And so to answer your question more pointedly, I think that I became a doula because I'm interested in preserving people's childhoods for as long as possible. And so when I was I had my friends' students were like 12, 13, 14, and they were pregnant or about to give birth. I was really invested in this process, of preserving their own childhoods for them and helping them think about parenthood along with being a child, right? Which then fuels my whole philosophy of life, right? Which is that like there's no such thing as adulthood. We're all just aging children. And like trapped in this adult supremacy world. But no, I think like ultimately the biggest reproductive one of the largest reproductive injustices is that we are completely robbed of that realization, right? That we are too precious. We are also precious, and we're also children. We are also babies. And I being a doula really helped me reckon with that and reckon with that like that break that was happening in people who were children, right? 12, 13, 14-year olds. But then like on a very like obvious, level, I would love to say that I have the opportunity to work with more Black families and that I'm in the birth room and I'm helping them have their beautiful water births, but in the reality that is medicalized racism and obstetric violence and the politics of payment and the gig economy in Baltimore. Being a doula, I think it has also demystified what reproductive injustice work looks like, and that largely doula and birthwork practices are practices that only white women can afford. And I that's a realization that I didn't have until I came to a predominantly Black city like Baltimore, unfortunately. But that being said, there's so many great, like doula organizations in Baltimore that are doing so much amazing work. Um, but I would say, like, as a doula, I feel very jaded about the work that I'm able to do around um, thwarting reproductive injustice. I think that the quotidian work I do today, I think raising children, writing poetry, finding pleasure in my life, loving people and being loved, is the real political work that I do against reproductive injustice. Thank you for your question.
We do have another question. As a Black mother conducting this research, how do you stay inspired and or personally process grief one may experience while both researching and sharing this important and familiar subject matter? Thank you for your question.
Well, that's a great question. This is also a question that I don't know if I feel inspired all the time. I feel very compelled. And I feel like it is my work to do. I feel sometimes very like it's a very spiritual question. That's a spiritual question for me. I do feel like this is my spiritual work to do. Um, and it really to remember, right? And experience that which people weren't allowed or weren't able to experience, right? These things like love and pleasure, play. Um, but I guess you're catching me on a down day because I would say I don't deal with it. I don't deal with it. I don't deal with it well. Especially, like we're living in the age of whatever we're living in now. It's like so unnatural what's going on. Well, that's, loaded, but I'm like every time I look at my phone, there's like another child being taken away from their parents. And so I don't know, I don't think I don't think you're saying inspired like a positivist thing, but I do think that sometimes I feel like the work weighs me down, but it is still it's my mandate and it is my job to do it. And then there are moments when I look at the work, or maybe not just the production, but the creation of the work, and I realize I'm like, oh, this is like the only way out is through, is the actual writing. And that's so I guess that is really how I process. It's the creative process of it. But otherwise, no, I mean we're holding it together by chewing gum, okay, and like scotch tape over here. But but processing the grief is really hard. And it's really done best in community or in some sort of, relationship to another.
Thank you for these answers. Um, I don't see another question, but again, I'm not sure if I'm missing anything. So in the few minutes that we have left, if anyone would like to jump off of chat, or pardon me, unmute themselves and jump on to ask their question or even to share their thoughts around this conversation, we welcome you to do so. Or a thought in the chat, and
I
I
would,
will. Oh
can
yes,
I
please.
make a comment? Yes, Dr. Collins, what amazing work. And just to hear you reflect on this, on the spiritual toll, the emotional toll, the affective, physical toll, is really not to say I'm not using the word inspiring lightly, but as someone who also does work on Black women and violence, I understand that struggle of the grief and also the calling, the mandate. And so this is really just more of a comment that celebrates you, that celebrates this work, and celebrates just what I know, what I know is on the trajectory to much more greatness. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your brilliance with us. And thank you to the moderator as well for these excellent questions, this excellent conversation. I just feel like very glad to be in the room. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tynes. I appreciate you so much. Dr. Tynes was also very instrumental in the formation of this work, so thank you for being here.
Thank you for your presence and for your feedback. All right. If there are no more comments or questions, we will wind down. So I want to extend another thank you to Dr. Collins for this work, for this conversation, and for just your willingness to dive into these questions today and to have this conversation. To Joelle and Zara at the Clifton House, thank you again for curating this event and for having us both here.
Thank you, Dr. Webb, for your amazing questions, for your amazing presence, holding us in the light, and your close reading. I think such an intimacy to be a writer and then talking with someone who's read the work so closely as you have. And I really appreciate that type of care. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I ditto to all of that. And that's obviously an understatement. Molly, Nadejda, I there's such a sort of rich conversation, and I was holding this tension that I think was, that's I think present. I think you both sort of just or mentioned this a bit, which is both, like the voluntary and involuntary like gestures towards like witnessing and documentation that at times I think it falls on the hands of very few who, can't help but um, to document, to witness, to hold the memory. And, even I think in you're looking at this sort of really profoundly vast and wide body of research and trying to synthesize that into something that we're able to learn from is there's weight to that. And so I just want to acknowledge that, you know, um, it is deeply meaningful work, and I'm deeply grateful for what you've contributed to this book. And to Nadejda, the questions tonight only you could ask, only your way of listening, and opening the fold to sort of get to someplace deeper with them. So I am deeply grateful to you both. Um, and I, again, thank you for everyone who sort of attended. I do want to say that if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, please pick up a copy of Molly's book. It is available through the link that I posted in the chat. At Greedy Reads, you can get a signed copy. Again, thank you everyone for being able to pivot to virtual, and we wanted to keep an essence of the intimacy, and so we're able to sort of purchase the book and offer an intimate sort of signing from Molly. So please support. Before I go, though, Molly and Nadejda, how can the folks support your work continuously? Where can they follow you? How can they, just stay abreast to the work that you're all doing?
Yeah, I post the majority of my work on Instagram, which is at Protect Black Motherhood. And I also post, my most recent writings and events on there as well.
Thank you again, Joelle. You can also follow me on Instagram. I dropped it in the chat. Otherwise, Life Code is always doing something amazing. So you can also check out the Life Code website, and I'll put that in the chat as well. And thank you both again.
Both. I'll close by saying that if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, I welcome you to return to the Clifton House in Baltimore physically next Friday. We have an event with Rachel Eliza Griffiths, and we welcome all of you to come and join that event and to really just, stay abreast to the Clifton House. So follow us on Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn or a newsletter, any way that you want to engage. It takes a village to make sure that we lift this home and make it orbit. So thank you all for being here this evening. Deep, deep gratitude to you all. And I hope you all stay warm if you're in colder climates. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Joelle.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.